He was up here, as you probably saw on your news feeds in the last few minutes. We announced negative 0.9% GDP growth for the second quarter. That is breaking news. And to discuss that really precarious situation that we face as a U.S. economy today, I'd like to welcome to the stage our great friends, Steve Moore and Andy Puzder, who I think are two of the best thought leaders on this. Do you follow them? Aren't they great? And they're great friends of ALEC, they're great personal friends, they're mentors of mine, and Andy's been in this. In fact, as we talked a lot about ESG throughout this week, Andy was one of the very first people in the country to identify ESG and radicalized ESG as a problem. And of course, he's longtime CEO of CKE, Hardee's and Carl's Jr., has been affiliated with many of our friends around Washington, such as the Heritage Foundation, and has been a frequent helper to us at ALEC working with state legislators. And of course, Steve Moore really needs no introduction to this group. He's a frequent ALEC speaker, sits on our ALEC Private Enterprise Advisory Council, and is such a great friend and a co-author of our Rich States, Poor States report, which, by the way, at your tables, you have the brand new full 14th edition of Rich States, Poor States. So make sure to pick one up before you leave. So, gentlemen, well, I think I have to say this. Utah is #1 for every single edition of Rich States, Poor States. So where's our Utah table? I think I see you right there. So, gentlemen, let me start with this. We saw these horrible numbers. We're almost facing a stagflation. We are facing stagflation for the first time since the Jimmy Carter era. What in the world is going on with the economy today? And maybe, Steve, we'll start with you and go to Andy from there.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Lisa, for the great job that you do. Doesn't Lisa Nelson do an amazing job as the president of this great group? Thank you, Lisa. It's so wonderful to see. I think there are like 600 people in this room, which is more people than the total number of people who signed up for CNN Plus. So that's pretty amazing, isn't it? Okay, so look, this economy is in some deep, deep trouble. I just brought a couple of quick slides I wanted to show you because we're seeing this continued trend of people moving out of blue states into red states, and you can see that, if anything, that's accelerating. I hope, for those of you, how many in this room are from Illinois, California, or New York? Any legislators? I'm sorry. It's just not going well there. But, this is the trend that is actually speeding up. It's not falling. And then, if you'll just show this next chart, this is really, hold on, I thought. We've lived through this 2 years of COVID, and I want to just applaud the legislators in this room from the red states. But you can see we did with ALEC a grading of how states dealt with the crisis. And you can see the states in green are the ones who did it right, and the states that are in red, and you see that one state that's in black, that's New Jersey, which gets an F-. But you can see that a clear pattern here. And I want to make one point really clear, because this is really critical, because what's happening in California right now, where they're talking about more shutdowns. Never, never, never again should we allow the government to shut down our schools. Never again should we allow them to shut down our businesses. Never again should they be allowed to shut down our churches. It was a catastrophic policy, never again. So just moving on, can you show the next one? You can see, our states are doing so much better on unemployment. And this has been consistent for the last 2 weeks. This shows so clearly, Jonathan, that our ideas are working. Right to work, lower tax rates, less regulation, all these things matter. And you can see the states that are just stuck at the bottom. And that's a tragic situation. I'll say one thing about inflation, then I'll turn it over to you, Andy. This inflation is a cancer cell in our economy. The nominal GDP grew by 8%, which is normally a really, really good number. The problem is when you have 9% inflation, a lot of Americans think it's higher than that. You just can't get out of this. I mean, most of us at this table, I think, Jonathan, you were too young, lived through the 1970s when you just had this, it destroys the stock market, it destroys businesses, it destroys family finances. The average family has lost $4,000 of income this year under Joe Biden. So inflation is not just bad for the overall economy, it hurts the lowest income people the most, which is so ironic, right? Because all the left talks about is inequality, and their policies have created more inequality. One last thing, and I'd love your thoughts about this, Andy. I literally could not sleep last night. I was so upset about what happened yesterday with this news about a potential deal between Joe Manchin and Chucky Schumer to do another $1 trillion spending bill. We need, Lisa, all hands on deck to stop this atrocious bill. This is one of the worst bills I've ever seen. It doubles the IRS budget. It has a massive tax increase on our businesses, Andy. They want to give $30 billion more to the Department of Energy, all on and on and on and on. I still think we can defeat this, but we need a wholesale, our whole movement behind stopping this bill, because it will douse a forest fire of inflation with kerosene if we allow that bill to pass. So let's, Andy, make that a high priority, and I'm happy to turn it over to you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think there really is a broader picture here than just this bill. The bill is a terrible idea. But think about where we are. We're right now in a situation where we have incredible inflation because demand is up here and supply is down here. Now, there's two things you can do. You can reduce demand, which is very painful for the people that are creating the demand, which is us. It's consumers. It's your constituents. So we're going to the Fed is causing that pain. What sense does it make? While the Fed is causing the pain of trying to reduce spending, reduce demand, for us to spend another $500 billion. I mean, the problem is we spent $1.9 trillion back in March of 2021. And if you look at the graph on inflation, you can see it just as Larry Summers predicted. It spiked as soon as we passed that bill. What sense does it make to spend more money while the Fed's trying to drag demand down by reducing consumption? At the same time, what we should be doing is driving demand down. The Fed's doing what it should do. We're in trouble. They need to do this. They maybe need to do more of it. On the other side, though, to reduce the pain of bringing demand down, we should be increasing supply. What we learned in the Trump administration is it doesn't matter how high demand is. If supply can meet it, you don't have inflation. You just have to have supply meet demand. So let's get supply up. Well, how do you do that? Well, you don't do it by imposing more taxes, as this bill would do. You might do it by making the tax cuts that are out there permanent. That would help. You don't do it by increasing regulation, which discourages businesses from growing, which is what the Biden administration has been doing. You do it by focusing on domestic energy production, which could bring down fuel prices, which affect the price of everything. So if we did some supply side economics at the same time, we were driving down demand, we might find that we didn't have to drive it down as far as we're now going to have to. So why, with the numbers you see from Steve, and with what I just said to you, which I think is patently obvious to anybody that took a high school economics course, if it's that obvious to everybody, why are they doing this? And I think Brian Dees was on TV a couple of weeks ago on CNN. And he was asked about how these high oil prices were affecting regular Americans. And Brian Dees is a member of the President's National Economic Council. He's a high-level economic advisor to President Trump. He was asked, what do you say about these high oil prices affecting average Americans? And he said, well, this is about preserving the liberal world order. Now, if that doesn't tie into what Vivek said, I don't know what does. Right. That's what this is about. These people they know what they're doing. You have to be really stupid not to know what you're doing if you're doing the things they're doing with the numbers that you see from Steve Moore. And they're not that stupid. I mean, this is not unintentional. This is obvious error, and I think they know it. And the people in this room are the people who are going to have to fight back against that.
Well, so Andy, can I show you just one more chart? Can you put those charts up again? I wanted to show you one other thing that amplifies the point that you were just making, Andy. And this is, well, first of all,
Andy, I just want to, actually, Brian Dees is a BlackRock alumnus, one of many in the administration. So
that's right. He came from BlackRock.
That is.
That explains everything.
Right? Well, part of it. worth pointing out.
So here's the spending spree that we talked about. You know, like we spent a lot under Trump to deal with COVID, and then we came in with the $3 trillion extra. So this is more money than we spent on World War II, adjusted inflation. But I want to show you one other thing that I think is really important. This is the Biden energy strategy. And I'm always asked when I give talks about the economy, are these people doing this intentionally? By the way, how many of you think they're doing this intentionally? A lot of people do. I don't know if it is. But if it were intentional, they're doing a pretty good job of it. And the way you destroy a country's economy, or a good way to do it, is to destroy its energy supply, right? Now, so look at the green line there that goes straight up. That, Andy, that's the shale revolution. That was incredibly, that's the story of America, these incredible new technologies that tripled in 8 years our oil and gas output. And the left and you can see we were above Russia and Saudi Arabia when Trump left office. We were actually exporting oil and gas. Now you see how that green line goes straight down? Effectively, that is the Biden energy strategy. I mean, can you believe it? Can you imagine anything more destructive to a country's economy than to destroy its energy supply? We get 7% of our energy from wind and solar power. Even if we were able to triple that, Vivek, where are we going to get the other 80% of our energy? This will destroy our economy, and yet this bill that apparently they've agreed on is another $50 billion for this climate change agenda, which is a cancer to our economy. So that is so problematic, and we have to stop that.
Well, the other important thing on your chart, Steve, is, and you're probably all aware of this, but if you're not, I thought I'd point it out. Russia is actually producing more oil now than it did prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, and making more money.
We're the ones who are producing less oil than we did prior to the pandemic. So when they talk about the price of oil going up and it's Putin's not doing it. Putin's producing more oil than he did before the pandemic. We're going to spend all our time on one question if we
And meanwhile, coal.
Which we could, by the way.
I want to bring Vivek in here.
And by the way, China right now, there's a big story in the Financial Times. Right now, as we sit here, China is building 30 new coal-fired plants, and they're building the biggest coal plant in the history of the world. Does anybody in this room or in this country, other than John Kerry, really believe that the Chinese care about climate change? I guarantee you they don't. They care about global domination. And unfortunately, Andy, our policies are playing right into their
All right, gentlemen, we need to get to our second question. We got a lot to cover here. And I did think, what Andy, I wanted to key on something he said because it was so important. There's the hard way to tackle this problem and the easier way, the much more beneficial way, and that's the supply side way that you've been talking about. And there's some really needed, I think, recognition that's deserved from many of you that have been doing that at the state level. And then I want to bring Vivek in to talk about breach of fiduciary duty and the pension issue that we want to talk about. And that is this session, ladies and gentlemen, did you realize it took 110 years for the first 4 states to go from progressive tax systems to flat taxes? 110 years from the first state income tax in Wisconsin in 1911 to the present. In a 10-week period, we had 4 new flat tax states this year and across the sessions. And what an incredible accomplishment. And so where's our friends from Iowa? Governor Reynolds, John Wills, starting with Speaker Upmeyer several years ago, became the first. Where's our friends in Arizona under the leadership of President Fan and Vince Leach and our Arizona delegation? Mississippi, and then our home state delegation here in Georgia. Those, ladies and gentlemen, were the 4 new flat tax states that are doing exactly what you're talking about on supply side.
Well, obviously, they're reading rich states, poor states.
They're reading rich states, poor states. So Vivek, to bring you in, you made some really important comments on fiduciary duty, breach of fiduciary rules. Did anybody see what Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, and who's a Ron DeSantis fan here, by the way? We've got to have a lot of Ron DeSantis fans. He had a great press conference yesterday working with many of our friends. I know, Andy, you've been working with them. Vivek, you and your team have. This issue of keeping politics out of pension systems. You mentioned the takeover of the Exxon board from these activists. Pension systems are voting their shares against the interest of management in these cases, against the free market interest. Talk to us a little bit about that and what state legislators can do to fight back and get politics out of pensions.
Absolutely, and I had the privilege of spending an hour with him the day before that press conference. I think it's great to see some leadership actually coming from the states. I'm going to see if I can't actually tie this into the discussion that we just had on energy, just to make it tangible and real by way of example. Yes, the Biden administration is responsible for a lot of the shackles imposed on the U.S. energy sector. He's keeping a campaign promise, right? He said in September 2019, I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuels. That's an exact quote. That green line down is actually, it was up there on the chart, that green line, downward line, that was keeping a campaign promise, right? And so now, willing to beg every dictator around the world to produce more oil while imposing the very regulations that prevent us from doing it here at home, this is actually staggering, right? Going hand in hand abroad, while the leader of the free world could have had his own companies doing it here at home if the market could actually do its work. A lot to say about the Biden administration. However, there's one sense in which he's narrowly right in blaming the private sector, but it's not the sense he means. the private sector is in parallel imposing equal, in some cases even greater constraints on domestic energy production as well, because the money of our own citizens is being used to force that onto Exxon and Chevron and every other major US energy company. That's mystifying, right? Well, I'll give you one example. Exxon we talked about. Let's talk about Chevron. They voluntarily, by shareholder force, adopted a Scope 3 emissions cap. What does that mean? It means that Chevron as a company has to take responsibility for not just its own emissions, but not only double and triple counting, it's 10 times counting every unit of oil that they ship even upstream as well as downstream for every Amazon Prime delivery that's made. Chevron has to now take responsibility. Say an electric vehicle is delivered to your door, the fossil fuels that it takes to burn that are now Chevron's own responsibility because of a mandate imposed on them by BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. But whose money were they using to impose that agenda on Chevron? It was that of your constituents. It was that of the everyday citizens in this country and the pension fund money that accidentally, I think in many cases it was accident, voted in favor of that agenda. And so I think that is a large-scale problem that can be fixed not through lawmaking, but to take that capital back and really direct it to market actors other than BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and ESG-linked asset managers to put an agenda back. First, again, in the energy industry and in every other one, to tell companies to focus exclusively on doing what's best for selling great products and services to the market. That includes oil and natural gas too, rather than advancing these social and political agendas. And as it relates to US energy, the one point I will make is the farce at the heart of this is actually, it's evident in so many places, but one of the other places it's evident is in the opposition of that same movement to the one source of deliverance of energy efficiency in a way that also doesn't actually contribute to carbon emissions, which is nuclear energy. So the same movement that opposes that fossil fuel agenda also opposes nuclear energy. In fact, Vanguard's ESG funds, by rule, systematically exclude nuclear energy. Ask yourself why. And part of it, I believe, is that nuclear energy is too good at solving the problem. What does that mean? If you solve the energy crisis, you might have accidentally solved the problem that otherwise would have served as a vehicle for advancing many other agendas that had nothing to do with energy. If you rely on wind and solar, it's necessarily a cap on Western and American growth that allow the colonialized world or whatever the worldview may be to catch up. That's what's going on, is that cultural agenda takes shape in the form of these economic mandates imposed by the private sector, large shareholders onto corporate America. That's going to be easier for states to fix.
Let me add one thing. This is really important for the state legislators in this room. And there is kind of a solution to this, quote, crisis of climate change. And it's important because most of your states now have these insidious renewable energy standards that require your utilities to use 30 or 40 or 50%. In some cases, I think California wants to go to 100% renewable energy. One thing we can do as a movement to at least reduce the negative impact of this is to do what Europe has done. Europe has now defined nuclear power and natural gas as clean energy sources of energy. And guess what? They are clean energy sources. So what you need to do in your states is change your renewable energy requirements. Well, you should get rid of them altogether. But if you don't get rid of them altogether, you should redefine what clean energy is to include, yes, clean nuclear power, and yes, natural gas. The reason the United States is the country of all the countries in the world has reduced our carbon emissions the most. By the way, raise your hand if you knew that. The United States, most Americans don't know that because nobody ever tells them. The major reason we've been able to do that is two words: natural gas. And yet there's another example. Why in the world is the left against natural gas? Because it's cheap and abundant and it's made in America. That's why they're against it. So.
Well, if even Europe can get it right on energy, folks, right?
Yeah, right?
So I want to give the final word here to Andy, because you've given a lot of thought to this issue back on the fiduciary piece, and we have the new ALEC model on that. So for all of you that want to get politics out of your pension systems, that are concerned about what's been talked about on ESG and many of these other topics, Andy, bring us home here.
Sure. To just kind of summarize what Vivek was talking about, we do have ESG investing in this country as an effort by corporate and governmental leads to use the American private sector as a tool around the ballot box, as a tool to avoid the messiness and inconvenience of our democracy. It's a challenge, it's a threat to our democracy, it's a threat to our economic freedom, and it's a threat to our individual liberty. We have to fight back against this. But every state in this room, every one of you, every one of your states uses BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard to manage funds. They're voting against the economic interests of the beneficiaries of the funds that are invested in your state, and they're voting against the beliefs of people. If you're in a red state, they're voting against the beliefs and the political leanings of the people in your state. So what we've done at ALEC, we've come up with a bill that it's called the State Fiduciary Duty Bill, and it takes provisions from ERISA, it takes a regulation that Gene Scalia got passed under ERISA, and it basically says for our state to comply with your fiduciary duties to the beneficiaries of our funds, you cannot invest for political purposes. You can only invest in the pecuniary or monetary interests of the beneficiaries of those funds. Now, that may not sound like a wild idea, but ESG investing is opposed exactly to that notion. ESG investing says you don't invest to generate shareholder returns. You invest to accomplish leftist political goals. And until you pass a law, either this ALEC law or a law like it, the funds in your state will continue to be used to advocate for a leftist political agenda that includes not only green energy, it includes the social justice, these social HR policies where you teach your employees that they're either victims or victimized. Why would you teach your employees that? You've got to be an idiot CEO to teach your employees that. Or these government policies where you put people on your board of directors not based on their qualifications, their merits, or their character, but based on their race or their sex, which is something I fought against my whole professional career, but now seems to be the in thing. But it also goes even further to where we've got companies that the funds from your state are invested in, are taking your money, the shareholders' money, the money that should go to the people, the beneficiaries of these funds in your states, and investing them in things like defunding the police, support for Black Lives Matter, right? Or to send women to states to get abortions that may not be in compliance with the laws in your state. They're using your money, the money that should go to the people on whose behalf you're supposed to be investing. So we have something called the State Fiduciary Duty Bill. What's the exact title, Jonathan?
The Employee Protection Act, yeah.
Okay. Anyway, and Mike Thompson, I don't know where Mike is, but he's got a breakout session on this coming up shortly.
Yep.
This is an important piece of legislation. I can't think of anything you could do in your state that would be more important than stopping BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. Why are you letting them vote and spend your money?
Mm-hmm. Well, very good. Well said, Andy. And unfortunately, folks, we are out of time for this amazing panel, but please join me in thanking these fine speakers and economic leaders. Boy, we face some challenges, don't we, as an economy and as a nation going forward with people like that and with the great work that you're doing, ALEC members leading the way in the states. I'm optimistic for the future, for sure.